Good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movement Matter. My name is Tara Garaya, and I'm the President and CEO of the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, or MBEP. I'm very happy you could join us this morning to engage in a very important conversation. I'm especially excited to be joined by Drs. Chris Benner and Dr. Manuel Pastor to discuss their book and seminal work on what it means to have solidarity economics and what it means to our region here in the Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Benito counties. But before I introduce our speakers, I would like to share a new video about Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. To many in the region, we are familiar, and to some we are new, and we welcome your partnership. For those of us who live and work here, we know what Monterey Bay means to us. From the beaches to the redwoods, from agricultural fields to historic landmarks, we cherish the beauty of this environment. However, we know that it takes more than appreciation to live and thrive in this region. It takes vision. We envision prosperity for all who live and work in the Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey counties. I'm Tara Garaya, President and CEO of Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, or MBEP for short. Our mission is to improve the economic health and quality of life right here in our backyard. At MBEP, we are laser focused on key initiatives that benefit everyone in the region. The blueprint to success is written in our research papers, mapped out in strategic initiatives, and put into action by leaders like you, who believe in our collective vision of the region, uplifting the stories of the Central Coast. It's a story of hope because our children need reliable internet access to complete their homework at home. It's the story of balance between life and work because people who work here deserve housing here instead of wasting hours in traffic. And it's the story of achievement because local tech companies are providing real opportunities for the most exciting new careers in aeronautics and aerospace engineering. MBEP convenes leaders to the same table, sparking new ideas from intentional and mindful learning. Those ideas evolve into policies that promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for the entire region. We are your champion for broadband, your neighbor and ally for housing, your advocate in workforce and economic development. We are the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and we want to be your partner. Join us. Learn more by visiting our website today. Dr. Chris Benner and Manuel Pastor are authors of Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. They want us to imagine, and they invite us to create a new sort of solidarity economics approach grounded in instincts for connection and community. They will talk more about that in just a few moments. Dr. Benner is a professor of environmental studies and sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's a Dorothy Everett Chair in Global Information and Social Entrepreneurship. He currently directs the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change and the Institute for Social Transformation. Dr. Manuel Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Equity Research Institute at USC. And Dr. Pastor is the chair of the Civil Society and Social Change at USC and holds an economics and PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And together they have done tremendous work as we talk about inclusive economics and what it means to connect business and community. And I will turn it over to them. And again, Drs. Benner and Pastor, thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you join us again at MBEP. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. It's Manuel
and Chris Benner. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this discussion.
And we're actually coming to you today, believe it or not, from Bellagio, Italy. I know most of you think we're in Las Vegas at the Bellagio Resort Hotel gambling. We're actually on a 4-week writing retreat, trying to produce our next book. But what a pleasure to be with you. I actually also really want to thank you, Northern Californians, for welcoming a Southern Californian into your midst. I know that you look down on us because my wife is from Northern California and views it as a major act of charity for having married me. My only credibility is that I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz and actually taught also at UC Santa Cruz between 1996 and 2007. So I'm almost a homeboy from the Monterey Bay area, and super glad to be with you today. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint, and we're going to hope that it shows up okay. And Tara, I can see you. Can you nod if you're seeing a PowerPoint? Great. Often we worry about PowerPoints that have no power, that don't show up. We also worry about PowerPoints that have no point, and we hope that this will be one with some definitive points. So I want to talk a little bit about our work, Solidarity Economics, in this different kind of perspective that we think can inform more inclusive economic development, can build bridges between business and community, can think about how it is that we rely on each other to be successful. But part of what sets the stage for thinking about this is understanding what we've been through as a society for the last couple of years. COVID, a huge disaster that affected our families, that affected our communities, certainly that affected our health. But also COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. The racial wealth gap, which meant that some people simply didn't have a cushion to survive in tough economic circumstances. The tenuous nature of legal status for so many families, which meant that they didn't have access, for example, to the federal aid under the first CARES Act. The digital divide that many people thought was sort of a thing of the past, particularly if you're in close proximity to the Silicon Valley, but became so apparent with our school children and the sharp rates of difference for kids of color and white kids, higher income kids and lower income kids with regard to the resources that they had. So this was a disease that revealed our illnesses. It was also a disease that revealed our mutuality, our need to rely on one another, to wear masks in soup kitchens, etc. But it also revealed our deep political divisions as a society, with some making masks a political football and weapon when they were really just a way for us to respect one another. And it all occurred in the context of 2020, in which the murder of George Floyd made completely apparent the imperative to deal with racism in our policing, but also that racist policing was the tip of a racist iceberg of inequalities in education, in the environment, in our economy. So what it's really made clear is that while some have wanted to talk about the language of recovery, how do we get back to where we were before? There really is no going back to a normal that did not work for so many, that had so many communities left behind and kept behind. And so how is it that in this moment we reimagine, restructure, and renew a vision? And this is something which is being made possible by SERF, by the Community Economic Resilience Fund, which is asking 13 regions across California to reimagine what they might look like and how they might invest with state dollars. But that's also setting the table for what we're going to do with the bipartisan infrastructure money, what we're going to do with the Inflation Reduction Act money, indeed, even what we're going to do with the CHIPS money as we move forward. And so in thinking about that, we've thought about three big imperatives. Now, we tend to think in three. I do because I'm a lapsed Catholic and everything occurs in a Trinity. I don't know why Chris does. He can go through his psychological reasons later. But we think that it's important for us to understand our demographic change and the need to center racial equity, to craft a new economic story, and to understand that getting there is going to require a little bit of bumpiness, because change often comes through conflict. And while we certainly celebrate and support collaboration, we know that for equity to make its way to the table, it often comes kicking and screaming. The civil rights movement brought the promise of a beloved community, but not without first marches, protests, sit-ins that made evident what was standing in the way of getting there. So in terms of centering racial equity, one of the very key things to understand is the changing demography of the state of California and some of the imperatives that that presents for all Californians, but certainly for folks in the Monterey Bay. So one of the really big things to understand about California is that, in fact, the way most people think about demographic change, which is the changing ethnic hue of our population, that a lot of that kind of demographic change is really slowing down in the state of California. If you look at the tremendous demographic change that's occurred from 1980 to the current day, 2020, we went from being about 2/3 white to being now about 2/3 people of color. That's a lot of change in 30 years. But if you look at how we're projected to move forward, yes, we're going to become a little bit more Latino going forward. We're going to be about the same share statewide, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and about the same share Black, a little bit less white. But actually that kind of demographic change has, in terms of changing ethnic composition, has slowed dramatically. That does not mean that demographic change has ended. I'll get to that before handing things over to Chris. But what it does mean is that we need to think a little more carefully about who we are and who we're going to be. One of the striking things about California is that the share of the state that's foreign born is actually now beginning to decline. And the reason why is that our immigrants are they are the longest settled immigrants in the United States. About 82% of the foreign-born population in the state of California has been in the country for longer than a decade. 80%, 82%. And that number for undocumented immigrants, that share is 70%. So we have very settled immigrant population tending to have kids, et cetera. And you can see that what that's meant is, if you look at the share of immigrants in the United States who live in California in 1990, about 1/3 of all immigrants in the United States lived in California. Today, that share of all immigrants in the United States living in California is down below 1/4. What's going on? Our immigrants may be long settled, but lots of immigrants are moving to other states after spending some time in California. Lots of immigrants are moving to new locations in the United States. It's one of the reasons why there's so much anxiety about immigrants in the rest of the country. We in Los Angeles, who've had immigrants for a long time, when we think of immigrants, I don't know about you, but I think about Korean taco trucks and the beauty of what that's going to mean for the rest of the United States. But others, it's new demographic change, ethnic change. They're a little bit frightened by it. One of the legacies in California, and certainly in the Monterey Bay, is mixed status families. Meaning, if you look at the data for the state of California, there's about 2.4 undocumented immigrants. But there's actually more US citizen family members who live with those undocumented immigrants, and then another 800,000 who are green card holders legally here in the country, who actually live with these undocumented family members. That means that we've got a lot of mixed status families. And when we start thinking about economic development programs that don't reach out and include undocumented folks, we're impacting those folks, to be sure, but we're actually also starving resources from our families. We can also look at economic inequality in terms of race. This is for the state of California. And what this shows you is something you're probably quite familiar with, that household income is not the same across ethnic groups. For white households in the state of California, it's about $83,000 is the median household income, about half higher, half lower, much lower for Black families, much lower for Latino families, actually slightly higher for AAPI, for Asian American families, although there's a lot of heterogeneity in that population, with Chinese and Indian origin families doing quite well, Southeast Asian families doing pretty poorly, sometimes pretty close to the situation of Black and Latino families. But the important thing to realize when you think about that data is, what does this mean, not just for all households, but for households that are raising children? So the next slide, same scale, same groups, same state, we're going to be looking at households with children under the age of 5. Watch what happens to those disparities. They increase dramatically. I'll do that again. So you can see now, if you're looking at white households or Asian households, that the disparities for households raising children, it's really 2 to 1. And what does that mean? That means that we're baking inequality into the future. Now, one comforting thing most of us would like to believe is that what really explains that difference in household income is the difference in education levels between ethnic groups. And certainly that is part of the explanation. I'm actually going to jump over this slide and just focus in on this one. What this shows you is something that you know to be true, which is you move from the left to the right, from having less than a high school diploma to having a BA degree or higher, that the level of median wages actually goes up. This is something very comforting to 2 professors, because we can say to you, if you get an education, you'll make more money. That's particularly comforting for someone who teaches at the University of Southern California, because it's so damn expensive to go there. We have to really actually suggest that it might be a good value proposition going forward. Santa Cruz, already a good deal. But one of the things that you're going to notice is that at each and every level of education, there's a pretty big gap between white households and Black and Latino households. And in fact, we only close the gap between white and Asian workers when we start talking about having a BA degree or higher. What does that mean? It means that as much as we would like to think that education is the silver bullet, it's actually just one part of the puzzle to solving the problem of racial inequity in the state. We need to tackle things like over-incarceration. We need to tackle things like uncertain legal status. We need to tackle things like persistent racial discrimination in hiring, which is what studies that are audit studies tend to show. We need to counter network effects where people hire the people they know and then reproduce at disadvantage and disadvantage over time. So yes, we're right to emphasize education, but we need to emphasize other forms of persistent racial inequality and tackle those as well. Finally, looping back to demography. I talked before about how it was that really looking forward in terms of demographic change defined by ethnicity, there's not a lot of change that we need to be thinking about. We're going to become slightly more Latino as a state, but it's not going to be as big a deal as most people imagine. But here's what's a big deal. What's a big deal is a little secret, which is each year, Latinos and Asians, like everyone else, get 1 year older. And one of the things that's going on is that if you look at the gray line, this is the median age for white Californians from 2010 going to 2060. And what you're going to notice is that median age, have older, have younger, kind of not going to change very much going forward. And often what we imagine, because it's been our past, is an older group, a senior group that's overwhelmingly white, facing a younger population, children, youth, who are overwhelmingly people of color, and the kind of demographic generation gap that ensues as a result of that. But what you can see from this data is that really the white population is not going to get a lot older. In fact, it's projected to get a little bit younger. But that the populations that are going to get older are the Black population, the Asian population, and the population whose age projections are the steepest are the Latino population. What does that mean Practically, for the work of MBEP and those of you concerned with economic development, it means the following. If we take the current racial wealth gap and we do not address it, it means that we're going to have an increasing elder population that'll be Black, Latino, and Asian that has not amassed assets sufficient to be able to support themselves as we move forward into old age. And that's another way in which we bake inequality in and bake interdependence in. So unless we actually prioritize racial equity now, we're going to wind up with problems in terms of dependency going forward. There will be severe problems for the state. So what are the implications? We need to stop seeing social infrastructure as distinct from physical infrastructure. We need to go beyond education and think about the other forms of racial disparity. We need to figure out how do we center marginalized voices and actually also center racial equity. And we need to go beyond diversity, meaning more different faces at a table, and think about how do we make diversity, equity, and inclusion be primarily about equity and inclusion, be primarily about a transformative agenda. In order to do that, in order to have success for the next California, Chris Penner.
So what we're trying to do with this book, Solidarity Economics, is contribute to a new way of approaching some of the issues and challenges that Manuel talked about in a way that presents a vision forward. It's not about talking about problems, it's about recognizing the mutuality that we have in our economy and the interconnections that we have, and the value of investing more in that solidarity or mutuality moving forward. And it's an effort to link some of the research on the ways that places that are more equitable actually do better economically with a policy agenda, but also a way of thinking about and talking about our economy that can help us in our dialogue with each other, in talking with each other, and developing common solutions. And so there is a book, and in solidarity with our readers, it is available free to download from the website, solidarityeconomics.org. We also have a comic book that tries to communicate these ideas in a little more popular fashion. Very soon, we will have a 20-minute video that summarizes the key points of solidarity economics, and Tara actually features very prominently in that video, sort of talking about what it means for some of MBEP's work and her own personal thinking about these issues. But I can also save you some time pursuing all those resources by summarizing, the key points from the book in 3 central points. The first is that we should always talk about our economy, not the economy. And this is really a reminder that economies don't exist in nature. They don't exist without people. They're shaped by us. They're shaped by our values. They're shaped by laws and regulations that we put in place. And the outcomes of our economy are shaped by who has influence and who doesn't in shaping those decisions. And that's a hopeful point because it makes us understand, or helps us to understand, that we can change our current economic circumstances. The second point is to really recognize the important role of mutuality and interconnection in our current economic structures. Those of us who are close to Silicon Valley and understand the importance of innovation and the connections between research institutions and businesses, and it's kind of an obvious point that economic prosperity doesn't happen from a single entrepreneur. It happens from ecosystems of people working together. The same is true in any industry, in agriculture, in retail, tourism, entertainment, key industries in our region. It's really the complex of connections that really make for economic prosperity. And it turns out that when we invest in equity, when we invest in that mutuality, that we do better economically as well. But the third point, as Manuel talked about earlier, is that some people benefit from our current economic structures. And if we're going to change the way our economy operates, there's going to be some difficult conversations that are part of that. And we have to shift those power relationships and expand those circles of belonging. So we need to invest in movements. And we have to understand movements as, maybe the tip of the iceberg we sometimes see is the protests in the street or the demonstrations. But behind that is so much of the day-to-day activities of building relationships, expanding connections, and building the organizations that can help change how decisions are made that shape our economy. So those are some pretty broad thoughts and ideas, and Manuel's talked about some pretty big issues for the state. And so I want to just talk a little bit more about what that means for the Monterey Bay region and what we might see if we come to this with a bit of a solidarity economics framing. And the first is to really recognize that inequality is undermining our economic well-being. There is some good news. I was just looking at some of the employment figures for our two-county area, Monterey and Santa Cruz counties combined, and looking at what's happened since the beginning of the pandemic. And some of the industries have recovered. Actually, farming and manufacturing is mostly food processing in our region, and some of the transportation and wholesale trade has actually recovered more than the employment we lost in the pandemic, and overall we're up. But we have lagging sectors, and some of those lagging sectors are the leisure and hospitality industry and the retail trade industry, what really drives tourism in our region, and our government institutions and government employment, which is actually a really critical part of economic activity, is also lagging as well. And part of what we need to think about is how as Manuel talked about, the things that became more obvious in the pandemic reflect deeper structural issues in our economy, and what does that mean for our paths going forward. And what you'll see here on the left is a summary of what is actually 2 books worth of analysis of metropolitan regions all over the country, hundreds of metropolitan regions, and really trying to understand what helps explain economic prosperity and economic performance, and how does equity relate to that. And this is the summary of one of the regression equations that we put together for that, of what derails sustained growth at a regional scale. And it turns out that income inequality is the single most important factor. Those regions that are more unequitable are likely to fall into recession quicker and be much less resilient in the face of economic challenges. But also those regions that have greater racial segregation, that have greater local government fragmentation in the region, which makes collective decision-making that much harder. And those places where political voting patterns between voting Republican versus Democrat are more spatially different. It actually doesn't make any difference if you're predominantly Republican or predominantly Democrat, but what matters is the level of spatial segregation in those voting patterns, which again undermines the mutuality that's so important for having economic resilience and economic performance. And what you'll see on the right is a map of our region that tries to pull together a set of indicators of opportunity in our region. And it combines indicators on economic, education, mobility and transportation, health, and environmental and civic engagement indicators of opportunity. And what you can see is a really strong spatial pattern where on the peninsula, the Monterey Peninsula and Santa Cruz, much higher opportunity, whereas in the Salinas Valley, the Pajaro Valley, Watsonville, much more challenging circumstances. Demographics is a really key part of that. If we look at these charts, again, 2 different charts here, and what you'll see in the statistics that I'm going to put forward here is a contrast between that coastal part of our region, Monterey and Santa Cruz peninsulas, and then the inland part, which is all the inland part. Most of the population of our region lives in that inland area in the Salinas Valley and Watsonville, and 2/3 of the population there are people of color. Predominantly Latino, whereas on the peninsulas, it's almost reverse of that, 2/3 non-Hispanic white. Much higher percentage of foreign-born in the inland areas, but actually a large portion of foreign-born throughout the region. But the per capita income is where we see that particularly striking inequalities, where in that inland part of the county where vast majority of the population lives, 32,000 is the per capita income compared to 50 or 55,000 on the coastal areas. And much higher percentage of the population living in poverty. 200% of the poverty line is a much more reasonable measure of economic opportunity compared to the official poverty line, especially when accounting for the high cost of living in our area. So real spatial inequality, and some of the age issues that Manuel talked about, a much younger population in the inland area, much older population. We know of a lot of retirees in the Santa Cruz and Monterey Peninsula area. And of course, that has a racial dimension to it as well, as Manuel talked about, that's reflected here. And you can see that that's, you know, a 21-year difference between the Latino population in our region compared to the non-Hispanic white region. So that's our future as the workforce in the inland part of our county. And that points to a really important metric that Manuel and his team at USC have developed as helping us think about this, is what we talk about as the racial generation gap. And it's that difference between the 65 and older population that are non-Hispanic white, which in our region is 70%, compared to the under 18 population, which in our region is, you know, 74% people of color. That's the future workforce. That's our future economy. That's the future of prosperity in the region. And that 44% gap is one of the highest actually in metro regions in the country. And that corresponds with lower levels. When you look at sort of that racial generation gap, it correlates with levels of investment in education, because those who are older, more decision makers, more voting power, tend to invest less in youth, children, education. So that's one of our challenges in this region. One of our other challenges in this region that goes along with those spatial differences in economic opportunity and income and the revenue that goes along with that is that our public sector has very different levels of resources available for public services. And you can see in Salinas, the city revenue per capita is 1/5 of what it is in some of the wealthier communities on the coast in Monterey and Carmel by the Sea, and even, you know, 1/3 to 1/4 of Santa Cruz. And yet our economy and labor force and labor markets are really completely integrated in this country. And I'll show that on the next slide. But what this slide shows is, again, the racial differences in that level of public sector resources, that those cities towards the right that have more per capita income tend to be more non-Hispanic white. Those places that have less resources on the left tend to be much more people of color. But this chart I found particularly interesting, and it shows that in every city in our region, the majority of the workforce does not live in that city. That people are commuting in between cities, some of them very long distances to get there. And yet, if you're not a resident of that city, even if you're a worker or employee in that city, you have very little voice in how public resources are spent, whether housing's built, whether zoning allows for more housing, despite the fact that you're contributing to the economic opportunity of that city. And much of the revenue comes from, especially in the coastal areas, from the transient occupancy tax, the hotel tax, as well as some of the sales tax that goes along with, you know, the businesses and retail trade that people are contributing to. So that's one of the major challenges we have in the region. But the good news is that we have lots of mutuality and interconnection and working together to address and solve these issues. And MBEP has been really an exemplary leader in that and the work that they've been involved with and others. And I'll just point to a couple of things, and hopefully we can get to discussion to learn your experiences and questions about this. But as we think about coming out of the pandemic, of course, the racial differences in both exposure to COVID and getting it, and then the vulnerability to that. This shows the age-adjusted death rate, mortality rate from COVID, and just shows that the cumulative impacts of low income, working in poor health circumstances, more difficult work conditions, plays out in terms of people's vulnerability to COVID and other health issues. But this region developed one of the really exemplary community health worker programs in the country, the VITA program, that came together through collaborative processes and people from Monterey Peninsula, coming together with people from the Salinas Valley and recognizing that we all need to come together to be able to come out of the pandemic, to be able to open up the businesses and the tourism businesses on the peninsula by helping to lower the pandemic rates throughout the region. And there's an important lesson here that Manuel can talk about as well, because there was state policy that he had some role in helping put in place, that as counties were trying to move through the colored tiers of, I forget them even now, red and brown and yellow and moving up to green, that they could only move at the pace of their most vulnerable census tracts. And it really required attention to those most vulnerable communities, because there's a recognition that the pandemics don't know political boundaries and they really move across space. But there's other promising examples in this area of the Salinas Inclusive Economic Development Initiative, Regions Rise Together, and this really exciting opportunity through the Community Economic Resilience Fund, where there is substantial amount of state resources invested precisely in trying to promote more inclusive economic development. And MBEP is playing a really important role as part of this broader Uplift Central Coast collaboration across 6 counties on the Central Coast, to not only come up with policies and projects that can help promote more inclusive economic growth, but really helping to stitch together the relationships in that social infrastructure that Manuel talked about, that we think is so important for moving forward. Because one of the things that I think we have to understand is that, we often talk in this country about talk being cheap, because we're more interested in, demonstrating impact or what actually gets done. But if we're going to build together this mutuality and really overcome some of these differences, we have to recognize that that takes resources. It takes time. It takes effort. That talk is not actually cheap, but that it's really important to invest in that, because it can build that social infrastructure that creates the basis for us moving forward together in both a more equitable and a more prosperous way. And just to finish up with the last few points, I'll turn it back to Manuel, and then we'll begin to get your voices in this discussion.
Well, thanks, Chris. I think a couple of things that I would add is, first, aside from starting a dialogue between sectors and modeling what that can look like and what power collaboration can have, it's important to measure. It's important to think about the mechanisms of accountability. And for that, it is key to develop data. And one of the things that we've tried to do over the years is to work, for example, with PolicyLink, a group in Oakland, to develop detailed statistical tools that can help to look at progress in a very disaggregated way by race, nativity, gender, education level, geography, one of which is the Bay Area Equity Atlas, which has a series of indicators that really help you understand economic progress and economic challenges. So we think that dialogue is important. We think that creating a sense of common destiny is important, but we also believe that data is important in terms of accountability going forward. Another data tool that we have developed, by the way, the Bay Area Equity Atlas is sort of the child of the National Equity Atlas. National Equity Atlas is partly what Chris leaned on for that comparison of the racial generation gap. It's got data on 150 metro areas in the United States, largest 100 cities, 400 counties, all 50 states, plus DC. So there's tools that are available. And when people say that equity has to take a second seat because we don't have the data to measure it, the answer is we now do have the data to measure it. Just like we know that equity is important for prosperity, we know that we can hold ourselves accountable to progress on it. Also, another tool for California is the California Immigrant Data Portal. California Immigrant Data Portal has, again, highly disaggregated data, including for folks who are undocumented in California, undocumented Californians by virtue of how long they've been here and how enmeshed they are. And this is another very useful data tool to try to think about who is being left out as we do our planning, who needs to be included if we are to truly thrive as a region and a state. And this is really crucial because one of the things to understand is the aging that I was talking about, and the fact that we are, as a society, likely to see us moving from what looks like a demographic pyramid in 1950 to a demographic cylinder in the year 2060. In the year 1950, we could think about lots of young folks. We could think about kind of working age people, and not a whole lot of folks lasting into those years above the age of 70. But with the advances in medical science, with the fact that people are now having less children, including long settled immigrants whose fertility patterns begin to resemble that of the US norm, and with the fact that we actually have less immigrants coming into the country that are filling in the middle, it means that we're going to have significantly more dependents in the future, folks who are retired, folks who are young. And what that means is that for every working age person, we're going to need people to be far more productive, far more generative of GDP. So there is an urgency about this, which has to do with the racial equity agenda. There's an urgency about this, which has to do with really our survival as an economy. There's an urgency about this, which actually just has to do with our humanity. Because we live in a world in which we've become so disconnected by geography, by income class, by the schools that are different that our kids go to, by a sense of divergent fates. And that is not a world we can afford to live in for a long time, not only because of its economic costs, but because of its costs in terms of our separation from one another. So what does this mean going forward? For us, we think it means, of course, solidarity economics. Buy the book. You can download it for free, but why not get your own hard copy? You can actually probably get autographed, at least by Chris. But it does mean that aside from buying the book, we need to be thinking about centering racial and economic equity, making sure that it's baked in, not sprinkled on, that it's our forethought, not an afterthought. How do we flip the script so that we're doing that? It also means flipping the script in terms of participation. How do we make sure that communities that have been marginalized actually become key to data generation, policy ideation, interpreting how we should move forward, determining our path? So how do we flip the script in terms of voice and power? And how do we understand that there will be challenges along the way? there is a way in which we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, with understanding that the challenges that have been raised over the last few years about racial disparities, they make us uneasy, but that uneasiness is part of growth. The challenges that are being raised about the polarized income inequality, those can make us uneasy, partly if we're ones who will benefit from being in an upper middle class group that gets good schools, whole food markets, decent standard of living, that we probably, even if we're comfortable, should be just a little bit uncomfortable about what that means. And we need to understand that as we struggle for a more equitable and inclusive society, we should expect bumps, we should expect conflicts, we should expect loud noise. And out of that, we can actually get to principled collaboration through principled struggle. So with that, lots of thanks. And I think we have an exercise to make sure that you can be generative of questions.
Yeah, what we thought we'd do is actually break up into small breakout rooms for 5 to 7 minutes or something like that. And we'd ask you to really answer 3 questions. One, as you're talking to each other in groups of 3 or 4. And what is, the first question is, what is it from our presentation that might resonate with your own experience, with your own perspective? What would you want to lift up that seems to resonate with what we're saying? But also, second, what's missing? We know we don't have answers for everything. We know there's important perspectives that we can't reflect, or there might be things that are problematic in what we're saying from your perspective. And we want to hear that. We need to learn collectively together because we'll be smarter. And then the final thing is, what questions do you want to ask us, or you're most wanting to ask others? And those questions have just been put in the chat. So take a look at those, and who's ever in charge of breakout rooms will now break everyone up into small little groups for a short discussion. Then we'll come back and have a larger discussion all together.
Right, I think we're slowly returning.
Yeah, I think so. We were having an amazing conversation. And it just returned.
Sorry to pull you away from your amazing conversations. But yeah, I want to have a chance to hear your input, your ideas, and any questions that you may have. And Tara, maybe we'll ask you to facilitate the questions and conversations, and people can raise their hands, and Tara can call on them, and unmute yourself and share your perspectives or questions.
Yeah, great idea. Please do raise your hand, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to note who wants to make a comment or a question. We had a really great conversation in our room too. The piece around data and the generational data really seems to resonate, at least in our group. We were talking about that, the inland versus the peninsula, and what are sort of the steps that we can use to mitigate that, and how can we be impactful? I think one of the comments was, so I need the answer, like, what next? What do I do? So that really resonated, that I can think of. Any other thoughts or comments from the folks here? Give me one moment. My settings are, Charles Alvarez, I think, had a question. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I'm from Pacific Grove, and I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on the housing, the housing element that's going on right now, and the aggressive housing plans that are being put in place. I know cities are being challenged to look at planning and zoning issues, that sort of thing, to make their locations more buildable. But cities don't build buildings, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on getting civic leaders to really not just commit to the housing element, but also committing to actually building equitable housing. And I feel like, I can relate to the economic numbers that you showed there, for Pacific Grove. I know the number of people who have to commute into Pacific Grove would certainly, be a benefit, I think, to have more equitable housing so people who work here and contribute could live here. But I fear that the civic leaders are just not motivated in that way. And just kind of want to get your thoughts on that. I know it's been an issue for why we failed in the last housing element, and I don't think we have the benefit of failing in the next housing element.
Yeah, starting right off with the easy questions, I guess, huh? Yeah, it's such an important question, Charles, and I really appreciate it. And, I think one of the things to recognize is that we've dug ourselves a really big hole with housing in the state, really, and some level of country, but particularly in the state and our region. And so, we're not going to solve the problem in our next housing element. We can, make incremental improvements, and we need to really transform kind of how we're thinking about housing and moving towards that is one thing I would say. Second thing is to recognize how deep a problem the lack of affordable housing is for our economy. It's really constraining our growth overall, but it also is contributing to all the stress, health problems, wasted time sitting in traffic and congestion. And so, yeah, it's a huge problem. I often think about sort of a North Star of where do we need to get to with housing, and then how do we move that direction? And the North Star for me is that we need to be talking again in this country in a serious way about public housing, about social housing, about taking housing out of the market. There's a bunch of reasons why housing markets don't respond to price signals very well. Takes a long time to build. There's all the political resistance, et cetera. And we'll never solve our housing problem in this country unless we make a significant public investment again in building housing. It has to look very different than what public housing looked like in this country in the past. I think there's lots of models out there about how it can be done well. I like to point to the example of the University of California at Santa Cruz, where faculty members can get access to subsidized housing where the university retains ownership of the land. So you're immediately taking out, anywhere from 20 to 60% of the price of housing by taking land out of the market that's owned by the public sector. Public housing can be supporting home ownership as well as renter. And this is a situation where professors can get access to home ownership, but in a way where you're limiting your ability to appreciate value over time. It appreciates only at the level of inflation. So it becomes permanently affordable. So it's a model that works very well. We could expand that to the vast majority of the population and working population and create mixed income communities. There are other examples of community land trusts. But the other thing that I'm very excited about is the ways that some of our school districts in the region are now investing in housing for teachers and trying to make housing available for teachers. There's another example of the public sector getting involved. I think we can build on those examples and expand over time. But ultimately, it does come back to some of the political movements and the fact that I live in Santa Cruz, and the people who would most benefit from more affordable housing in Santa Cruz can't vote in Santa Cruz. They don't have influence on the zoning patterns there. And until we can begin to change some of the broader regional movements and support for affordable housing throughout the region, we're going to be limited in that. Manuel, what would you add?
I would add very little. I mean, but to lift up that point in particular, because I think the fundamental thing is not seeing ourselves in the other. So feeling a sense of privilege by being in Pacific Grove and wanting to protect that, rather than thinking about the people who show up every day to do the work and what is the place for them. We're thinking about what the heck we're doing to our next generation of kids who are not going to be able to afford to live where we treasure living right now. And so I think that the work of community organizing, there was that slide that Chris talked about that had on the top face-to-face race to race, place to place. That's the bridge building that needs to take place. That happens through community organizing groups. You have a wealth of them. And that can happen through groups like MBEP, pointing out that the economic health of the region, including Pacific Grove, is going to depend on whether or not there's a workforce that's available. That was the trick, as Chris mentioned, behind the regulation that I was on the governor's task force on jobs and business recovery that probably irritated some of you, but heck, it was a great thing, which was that you could only open up if you got the testing activity in the sort of most distressed census tracts close to the county median. And once you did that, then you could begin to open back up. So I think those are the kind of, regulations we need to have in place, but also the kind of organizing and community connections that need to take place. Let's hear from more of our great audience members.
Absolutely, thank you. And I know Darlene Boyd, I think, had her hand up next. Darlene from San Benito.
Yes, from San Juan Bautista. Yeah, we're seeing in San Benito. I would have liked to see more demographics about San Benito County, but the expectations for infrastructure here are increasing exponentially, but yet our tax base is not. Part of it is because we're very agricultural, so we don't have a big commercial or industrial tax base. And a lot of our property is not being shifted into higher tax brackets from as Prop 13 allows. And so that our schools are really, really, really underfunded, because as a teacher, which was my past life, I can see that there's a whole big gap between children that are educated in Silicon Valley versus children educated in San Benito. Is about 20 or 30-year gap there. And a large part of the people to actually live and work here are working in public jobs, not so much commercial or industrial. And broadband is a very big issue. In San Juan Bautista, we're very lucky. We have two very good ISPs besides the regular ones. And I know that our county supervisor, who was on the line, was having issues with her broadband. And it's one of the biggest issues that we have here, just having access to be able to do the things that we need to do in order to raise the funds that we need to raise in order to do, fix our infrastructure. So thank you.
Thank you, Darlene, for lifting that. You're absolutely right. I often have challenges connected. And I actually operate out of a tech park, UC MBEP. So it is definitely a regional challenge in our rural communities. And I thank you for your comment on that and lifting that up. I see that Francine Rod, you're next with the question.
Yes, thank you so much. This is the third time I think I've had the pleasure of hearing this presentation, and every time I learn something new. So I want to really thank both of you for that and take copious notes and so forth and so on. So really appreciate that. I'm also really excited about the fact that you keep coming up with ways to share it in bite-sized opportunities, like the video that you're going to be sharing. And in our group, we talked about how we really appreciate the manner in which you present this information, so that it feels as if it is open and welcoming to people from different viewpoints, leading toward oneness and collaboration and building bridges, as you say. So with that in mind, one of the things I'm wondering about, because I do serve on different boards, I'm on MBEP board. So thank you, Tara, again, for bringing this to us on multiple ways and multiple occasions. And so in terms of sharing it with a board, it sounds like the 20-minute video may be one way to be able to share with people from different points of views, from different sectors, who might otherwise feel challenged by looking at some of this information. And I'm wondering how you help us with even the name Solidarity Economics might end up turning some people off. So if you can tell us a little bit about your intentionality around that and suggestions for how you think that we can introduce it in a way that doesn't automatically already turn some people off with that. I'm also hoping that we got the message that read the book, watch the video, and then what are some other really concrete steps that you think we can take initially to really help bring awareness and make movements related to all of this work to wake everybody up.
So I'll say a word and then we want to make sure we get in these final comments, but we wrestled with the word solidarity because we know that it has different meanings for different folks. And, we really stress when we talk the idea of mutuality and how much mutuality currently exists in our economy. A story I often tell, Francine, you might have heard it in another talk, is that I'm lucky enough to have an endowed chair. And I asked the guy, pretty wealthy, who funded it, how he made so much money. And he said, well, I treated my customers right, I treated my workers right, I treated my suppliers right, and the rest worked out. And most business people know that if you treat people fairly, your business is going to be more sustainable over time. So to some extent, part of the choice around solidarity is a bit of a provocation, because we don't think it should be a bad word to be in solidarity with other people, to care, and to have that be part of who we are and how we act. We also try, as you can tell, to present it with a smile, to present it with some jokes, to present it with an open spirit, to invite people in, to highlight the positive role of business folks, and in other talks to highlight the fact that there are some red areas in the United States which have done a remarkable job at bringing people together to deal with homelessness, to welcome immigrants, to invest in childhood education, or, for example, in Oklahoma City, to close the achievement gap between Black and white students in that area. So I think that we just try to be provocative where we think it's necessary and try to be welcoming as well. By the way, one audience, which I can tell you with First Five, which has been especially intrigued about this message, is First Five groups, because we're talking about children and the future. Anything you want to comment on, Chris?
No, I'd actually love to hear other comments here because we'll have to wrap up by 20 minutes past the hour and we'll make some maybe final comments, but love to hear what other people have to input. And thanks for that set of comments and questions, Francine.
Yeah, thanks, Francine. Let's pop over to Dr. Eduardo Ochoa. I see a hand up here.
Thank you, Tara. Wonderful to see you, Manuel and Chris, and to hear your presentation. And I was very intrigued, actually, by the name of your book, Solidarity Economics, and the word solidarity to me had a lot of, it evoked a number of thoughts, mostly positive. It had it reminisced of the solidarity movement in Poland. It also sort of resonated with the sense that among parts of America that some people feel like they're being left behind, and this sort of directly addresses that. I have two questions. One is, how does the economics part of this solidarity economics work? What sort of overall strategy or direction or industrial policy or whatever you call it? And are there some commonalities between some of the measures that the Biden administration is taking in terms of developing new industries and so forth? And then the other question I have is that in order to have a greater sense of community cohesiveness and solidarity, that also seems to be operating with a dynamic that's also pushing us away from globalization and towards more national autarky, and so there are some potentially negative implications of that. How does that all work out?
Two very easy questions, of course. I want to start with a point of personal privilege, which is, for those of you who don't know, to know that Ed and I have known each other for over 30 years, and he's been a profound influence on my thinking. He was really one of the first people when we were both in Los Angeles to really raise the issue about shouldn't we be thinking regionally rather than thinking about neighborhood development. And that was really a prompt for me to think about how do you build bridges geographically, and then use that to build bridges between sectors. In response to your first question, maybe Chris can take up the second. I do think that what the Biden administration has done with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a kind of form of solidarity with the future, about really seriously dealing with climate change, about putting regulations in place that require that there be community benefits and workforce development. I think that what the state of California has done around the Community Economic Resilience Fund and requiring community voice and community participation, I think there's some solid signs of what can be done at a policy level to encourage this kind of thinking. I think the biggest thing is going to happen, to get back to the question that Charles asked, when we ask ourselves the question, should our largest housing program at a federal level be a mortgage interest subsidy that goes to middle class and upper middle class people to buy houses? Shouldn't that at least be matched by expanding our Section 8 funds at a sufficient level so that poor people could also enjoy residential stability? So we're making some progress. We've got a long way to go. Chris.
Sure, and I'll jump in, and I really appreciate the question. And two things. I mean, one of the backgrounds behind the book Solidarity Economics was actually a report we did in 2018 called From Resistance to Renewal, a 12-step program for California for innovation and inclusion in California. And what that did is lay out a series of policy proposals in 12 different areas, from everything from housing to broadband to rural development. And then it laid out both a set of aspirational policies as well as sort of low-hanging fruit that we thought would be achievable in each of those areas. So, I think the specific policies that can help move this forward, we know what they are, and there's lots of opportunities for that. Part of the challenge is figuring out the political will to make them happen, and figuring out how do we get people involved and connected in that. So the other thing that we're going to be working on at the Institute for Social Transformation in the next year or so is actually a series of sort of short briefing papers that are really designed to help facilitate discussion about solidarity economics and housing, solidarity economics and our health industry, solidarity economics and care work and the different levels, and really to try and help concretize these ideas in those particular areas, grounded in data in our region, in the MBEP region, as well as pointing to some of the initiatives that are going on in each of those areas. So do stay tuned. The other thing, coming back to the data conversation, is that we've been in conversation with Tara and the MBEP board about actually doing a equity report, trying to look at the specific indicators in our region about how we create an inclusive economy that we're going to be working towards the State of the Region meeting in the fall to really try and help concretize a deeper understanding of those patterns in this region and what we can be doing about them. So yeah, this is one step along the way of those conversations, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you all.
Yeah, let's make sure to get Rose in before we leave.
Yes.
But I want to say to response to one of
That's
Ted's
right.
questions that I always thought
last
that the movement to regions was actually a step to the movement to a state movement around equity, to the movement for a national movement around equity, and hopefully really recognizing what the risk you're pointing out, which is that solidarity shouldn't be a way of dividing ourselves from other nations, but understanding the mutuality of our fate, particularly given the climate crisis, with other peoples and other nations. Maybe Rosa, before we go, Tara?
Yes. So Rosa Fernandez, if you can make the last comment before our professors have to pivot off and we conclude. So Rosa Vivian.
Yeah, so two comments. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's right on point. And the one is I'll echo Darlene's comments about trying to have data for San Benito County. That is very specific, because we are at a quandary here where we have high incomes, but we have significant disparities. And part of the high incomes is the commuter-based workforce that makes their money in places where they're very high income and they can afford the $623,000 median income house, right? So the other is the inspiration. Kudos to MBEP that inspired us to go to the UC Santa Cruz, and we did see the model of housing. And as an organization, we're a nonprofit community health center. Our board made the commitment to engage in the housing market, and we did take property off the market. I didn't know that that's how you called it, but we have a problem. We don't have housing for our staff. And we want to have housing for all staff members to offer an option so everyone has equity, not just the high income staff members. And it's how do we support organizations like ours that we are not developers, we are not in the housing business. We are doing this to ensure that, you know, our staff has a place to, safe place to live. And it seems like we continue to be against the wall in terms of being treated as developers. So it's like we need to look at housing differently, and we need to make sure that, yes, we have housing for everyone, but that we work with organizations to enable that.
Thank you, Rosa Vivian, for lifting that up. Again, thank you, everybody, for your time. But most importantly, before we conclude, I want to honor the time that Dr. Pastor and Manuel Pastor and Dr. Chris Benner were able to make this morning. I know they have another commitment in a few minutes. Thank you. This was very insightful. As Francine mentioned, every time I hear you and am engaged in the conversation and the data, I feel like I walk away with something new. And so thank you for educating us, and thank you for really activating us to do better. And so I appreciate all that you've been able to do for us this morning and continue to do. Thank you.
And thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you all for all your work, and really appreciate being in conversation with you and look forward to continuing to work together.
Excellent. Thanks.